All right, so I wanted to start out with a question. And in fact, the truth is that about what I'm going to talk, I have a lot more questions than I have answers. And so the question I wanted to start you out with is, what does a society really know about what's going on within it? We assume that the social intelligence we get about what's happening around us is reasonably accurate. But what I'm going to talk about is a category of events which we don't get actually a lot of social intelligence. And so what I'm going to talk about is UFO abductions. And I know this is quite a jump after Rob Swatek's talk, but I think this is a very important issue. And I'm going to talk about why the French don't have abductions, or think they don't. Okay, so you're all familiar, I assume, with the category of alien abductions. This is an enormously strong part of popular culture. We all have image of how this stuff operates and so forth. And I'm not really going to go into this in much detail because I'm much more interested in the reporting process. How does society find out about stuff like this? And so the basic problem I'm going to consider is, why is it that the French don't think that they have abductions? And of course, your question might be, why would I think that they do? Okay? So the data are kind of interesting. How big is the difference between what the French see and what we see? Okay? So what I did to find out how many abductions have been publicly reported is I called up Dave Jacobs, who has spent the great majority of his life, actually, at this point, looking at the abduction phenomenon. And I said, well, considering all the people who are looking at abductions and so forth, what do you think the number of reported cases is? And we talked about this for some time. This is a figure we arrived at, okay? Now, believe it or not, this appears to be the number that the French have arrived at, okay? And why do I say that? Well, here's a good example of why there aren't French abduction cases, okay? If you look at the number of people in France, it's 1/5 of what the US population is, okay? So if we equalize the populations and so forth, the United States would have 15,000 cases instead of 75,000 cases, and France would have 100, okay? If you divide one into the other, it comes out 150 times. Could there possibly be 150 times the abductions in the United States that there are in France? No, can't, okay? So there are two possible explanations. And by the way, the original version of this talk was quite funny. But people told me to take out all the slides making fun of the French and the Americans respectively, so you'll have to think what I would have put instead. So the first hypothesis is simply that the Americans have simply imagined or misidentified abductions through some sort of mass hysteria or misidentification process aided by rumor or popular fantasy. And I'm sure that most Americans who think about it are probably inclined to this explanation. The other explanation is maybe the French have the same number of abduction experiences, but they are not as likely to report them. So let's look at these two hypotheses. Okay, so first of all, let's look at hypothesis number one. What are abduction cases like? And I'm not going to go into this in great detail because I think most of you have already been subjected to this and so on. But basically, an abduction consists of a period of missing time, a memory frequently obtained under hypnosis of being taken aboard a UFO, further memories of sexual intervention by alien beings, and, interestingly enough, in most cases, a history of similar previous experiences. Okay? The problem with this is, oops, I must have skipped a slide here. Did I go back? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so common sense suggests that waking up or coming into sleep provides a time of high suggestibility. Furthermore, hypnosis provides a ready means of implanting false memories, especially associated with popular culture. So maybe it's all the false memory syndrome. The problem with this is that abduction cases, if you look at them as a whole, don't really fall very well into this framework. For instance, many abductions take place while awake or driving. Some abductions involve pairs of people or larger groups. Some abductions are witnessed by those not abducted. Sometimes people wake up in the wrong bed or with the wrong pajamas or, by the way, with other stuff that suggests that they've been outside. And finally, what causes the post-traumatic stress if this is simply an hallucination? Okay? All right, so let's look at hypothesis number 2. Maybe the Americans and the French have the same rate of experiences, but the Americans are more likely to report. Okay? So maybe abductions in France are, in the words of one researcher of near-death experiences, Raymond Moody, widely experienced but very well hidden. So this is what I call a hidden event, if this is true. And a hidden event basically has the kind of configuration you see here, that the number of cases that you can see are a very small fraction of those that are really out there. Now, in previous talks to the Society, I've talked about meteorites, I've talked about the battered child syndrome and so forth. I've done actually quite a number of studies on hidden events. And again, hidden events are described by the property of being widely experienced but very well hidden, okay? So the problem with hidden events is that we all assume that the social intelligence system functions in a more or less constant way. That stuff kind of percolates up at more or less a steady rate and doesn't change. But maybe it isn't consistent. If we see it as a network system, the chances the sighting is passed through it may change greatly. In other words, the nodes in the system don't have a constant propensity, but exhibit a changing parameter to transfer information. And so maybe France has different reporting parameters. So the problem, I'm going to go to the next one here. Whoops, sorry, I skipped a slide here. This is what I want. All right, so hidden events go through the following kind of transformation. Is that typically, in the beginning, they start as uncorrelated phenomena. Previous to 1980, UFO abductions were just exactly that. Is that there were probably a handful of cases, and in about 1980, Bud Hopkins published a book called Missing Time, and after that, people began to collect abduction cases. And I remember saying to Hopkins at the time, I said, what will happen, Bud, if this becomes a paradigm? You know, what if it becomes, you know, something that appears to be the nature of the UFO phenomenon itself? So the second stage basically happens when there is social discussion of these events, when there's a period of controversy. So the parameters change basically from something being essentially covered up to all of a sudden something becoming controversial. And finally, it can become an accepted phenomenon that I also should have added. It can become completely rejected. Somebody can say, well, this really didn't exist after all. So as we go from one stage in the hidden event progression to another, the parameters shift so the reporting becomes higher. This happened with both meteorites and the battered child syndrome, and it also has happened with a variety of other things that are like, for instance, the battered child syndrome. The battered child syndrome let loose a whole stream of things about battered spouses, the sexual abuse of children, so on and so forth. So the interesting thing about the battered child syndrome is that the increase in the number of reports was spectacular. Originally, the people who were the proponents of the battered child syndrome thought that there might be hundreds of cases. In fact, they actually hired a sociologist to do a national survey. He came up with 700 cases. What's the real number? Well, it's more like 1 million. Okay, how many orders of magnitude is that? Quite a few, okay? So this is then the nature of a hidden event, is that the part that you can't see may be orders of magnitude more than the part that you can see. So what is it that shifts the parameters? Well, obviously, what changes here is that things begin to become reportable. And in the battered child syndrome case, what happened was we created special social institutions for looking into battered child cases. Many of you may have had the experience of going to a hospital with a child with a bloody nose or something like that, and the next thing you know, you're filling out a questionnaire or you're responding to third-degree style questions and so forth about what happened to the child, okay? So what that is a function of the change of the reporting system. Now, basically, is that we have parents who are afraid to take their kids to the hospital because they're afraid they're going to get reported as child abusers, okay? Whether this is good or bad is another issue. But the basic point is that the reporting changed. Now, in the United States, we have a context that encourages reporting because we have many writers and many books writing things about abductions. We have lots of talk shows and media presentations, and we have a culture that encourages, opening up and telling it all. Okay, so here are some of the writers. All right, many of you will recognize these books, and maybe even the writers themselves. I know everybody but Whitley Strieber. Strieber's book had 2 million copies published. 2 million copies, that's an awful lot of copies. Then we have people like Bud Hopkins, who had 4 books published, all of which basically required a tour. And so books lead to appearances on television, on the radio, and magazine articles, and elsewhere. And each one of these appearances, whereas the books typically run into the thousands, the appearances in many cases involve millions of people who can see these folks talk about the experiences, okay? What happens as a result of these appearances basically is authors get letters. Bud Hopkins' first article on some little men who were digging holes in a field in New York City generated sacks of mail, according to his obituary. And his other books presumably generated even more letters. In fact, Dave Jacobs, who has Hopkins' letters, said he got thousands of letters, essentially. So what do the French have to compare with this? Okay. The book on the left actually is published by a popular press, and I'm trying to find out at this moment actually how many copies of this she got published and whether she ever appeared on television or not. But for the most part, and this is obviously a book featuring Mr. Mack, but in French society, they don't talk about abductions. They're not supposed to have abductions. They don't believe in being public and so forth, and so there aren't many reports. Now, again, in each case, I'm trying to quantify all this stuff. How many letters did people get? How many reports were generated by appearances and so forth. But basically, and I should mention too that many of these books got translated into French. And so I called Dave Jacobs and I said, well, how many reports have you had from French people? And he said 22. That's why publicly the French have 100 abductions, because they don't seem to have reports, okay? So that's the question really that I'm going to leave you with. What is it about French society that discourages people from coming forward? Or maybe what's happening here is some sort of mass contagion. Maybe that's really what the explanation is. I don't really believe that for a moment, by the way, having spent an awful lot of time talking to abductees and know that there are lots and lots of people out there that I haven't talked to. So what's really going on here? We have two societies with very different reports. Is one basically the result of some sort of social phenomenon like mass contagion? And is the other simply the reflecting of reality? Or are there lots of reports out there? My suggestion basically to the French is, why don't you do a survey? Why don't you do a survey and find out? But so far that hasn't been done. Thank you. So I leave you with this question. What is it about America that generates these kinds of reports? I remember a book called Welcome to the New Age which had a page on welcome to your local alien abduction support group. Okay? How many of you have a community where there's an alien abduction support group? Okay? There's more than, yes, right. There are more of them than you think, okay? It's very un-French to think about an alien abduction support group. Okay, so I think we have some time for questions. Go ahead.
How about Germany, Belgium, Italy, Spain?
According to Mr. Jacobs, he has a website actually that collects abduction reports, and the foreign countries seem to have the same kind of abductions that we have. They don't have as many. But the interesting thing to me is that Mr. Jacobs, who's English and whose website is in English, is getting reports from France. How many reports would he get if it was in French instead of
yes, that's
English?
huge.
Okay, yes. So
what about England? Does that have similar to the States?
Sorry?
England?
Oh, there are lots of abduction cases in
Lots,
England.
Yeah. So there are no French websites, nobody collecting in France? That's your problem?
No, and in fact, a French researcher trying to put together for a recent meeting, this is what generated my talk, came up with about 24 cases, and he said most of these are pretty weak and so forth, and blah, blah, blah.
Were they English tourists?
Sorry? Yeah, so I said, I don't really believe it, okay? Now, of course, the reason I don't believe it is because I'm familiar with the dynamics of hidden events. I spent a lot of time looking at the meteorite controversy. I spent a lot of time looking at the battered child controversy. And the thing about the battered child controversy is in the beginning, the people who were the experts really believed it wasn't going on at all. The pediatrician stood up in a meeting and said, if I thought parents would do this to their kids, I would get out of pediatrics immediately, okay? And that wasn't an unusual reaction. But it wasn't until special social institutions were set up to collect reports that they began to see how big the problem was. So I think this, sir.
Okay, thanks very much. I just have a suggestion for you for follow-up research. You may be familiar with Steve Bassett and the Disclosure Project Paradigm Research, or maybe not.
Yeah.
Okay, but he's done a lot of reporting of disclosure or release of UFO-related documents in various countries, and I'm pretty sure France is in the group that has been releasing some documents. And then you might be able to check that out on his website. That's over the last, just recent, maybe 2-3 years.
Yes.
Secondly, he does a tremendous amount of international as well as US speaking. He's done a whole lot in Europe in the last year or two. Steve Bassett, Paradigm Research. Just do it on the Google and you'll find it. So he would be a good one for, I think, for you to talk with to see if this topic is coming up in his many discussions in not only in France but other European countries. So that's just a suggestion to, if you wanted to pursue this, to try to figure out whether, you know, where the truth may lie here.
Yeah. You know, the interesting thing about this is that, again, it's a function of the reporting system. There's lots of stuff, basically, that is hidden from, you know, ordinary gaze, unless you have special institutions to report. So, I mean, he may make a change and so forth, but I talked to a French ufologist, Gilles Bourdais, who's very smart, and who I think is probably one of the best researchers in the world. And he says he's investigated some local cases. But, you know, people don't talk about this stuff. Go ahead.
There seems to be a rather similar situation with regard to crop circles, as probably you know, that there's an extraordinary concentration in England, especially the southwest of England, and remarkably few in France. But America is sort of in between. And if, you know, a frequency or sort of belief of Americans in weird things is anything to do with it, you would think there would be more in America.
Yes. One of my original slides had a book called why people believe weird things, okay?
Yes.
Yes. Chantel.
Hi, Ron. I'm so curious why you picked France of all the places on the globe. I mean, I think that,
well, first
you know,
of all,
why not by geographical landmass, right? I mean, if I'm an alien looking to land, I'm going to look at China, India, Africa, you know, something of comparable size.
Yes.
And the French love UFOs. I mean, as a
They used
child
to,
living
yes.
in France, there were all these books, you know, so it's not like they're hung up. And maybe if they see one, they have a little wine and forget about it and move on.
Obviously, I left some things out of this speech. We did a big survey in the United States called, generally referred to as the Roper Report on UFO abductions. We discovered that we probably were very conservative in the number of abductions that we had thought previously. I have a lot of reasons don't have the time to go into why I think that there's probably, you know, far more abductions than the reports would give you any indication. But suffice it to say that I've never gone to a social gathering where I mentioned this, where somebody didn't come up to me and they said, you know what, I'm one of the people you were just talking about. Okay, if these experiences were rare, I would not have that experience. Sir?
Part of me wants to say it's the garlic. You know,
keeps away the UFOs like the werewolves and vampires. Yes.
But I just want to say that it's, you know, we want to joke about this, but it's really a very, very awful, horrible, serious situation.
Yes.
I just want to say that.
I really forbore going into the nature of abduction events, and I did that for a reason. The reason was I'm much more interested at the moment in the reporting process. But if I hadn't had a lot of field experience talking to abductees and so forth, I wouldn't be standing up here. I'm very interested in this, and you know, when I went off to the Yakima Indian Reservation to study UFOs there, I came across 2 abduction experiences just in the course of 2 weeks. This is an Indian reservation, which has presumably a different culture than the rest of the country. I came across 2 very strong abduction cases, so what can I tell you? Thank you very
Ron,
much.
I have one other question for you.
Yes.
The French actually have a fairly good public UFO reporting system through the gendarmerie.
They do.
People can actually call the police,
Yes.
and the police will actually investigate the case.
That's right.
Unlike in the United States, where the police send them to MUFON or the National UFO Reporting Center. So have there been any abduction reports to the local police?
The Army has a very good system for reporting rapes. Okay? What percentage of people in the Army who get raped report? The answer is about 7%. Okay, I've done a lot of studies of other kinds of hidden events. So the problem is that the reporting system is there, but people really are reluctant to use it. I mean, that's my guess. I don't know that for a fact, but I think that's probably the reason. It's the people who have abductions, for the most part, are extraordinarily private. They really don't want to talk to anybody about it. I know cases where, for instance, people I knew who knew I was interested in UFOs apparently had abduction experience, and they said nothing to me.
Thank you very much.